Hi, History 115. Nice to see you all. Coming at you from my study at home in Massachusetts, Florence. I hope you are all well. Today, this is week 11, lecture number 1, and our topic is the Great Leap Forward. Although I'm going to start you with a little bit of art today. But here, let me put up the terms first of all. And again, these will be available as a PDF on Moodle if you want them. So starting from the anti-rightist campaign where we left off, we'll be looking at sort of agricultural policies in the People's Republic of China leading up to the Great Leap Forward. But before we get to all of this, let me put these aside, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about aesthetics and art. We talked about literature and sort of the mandate in the early People's Republic that literature was meant to serve the masses and serve the revolution. Art was in a similar, art worked in a similar vein, and I want to just give you some, I want to show you some examples here. Let's see, let's put up the little PowerPoint. We're going to have a little slideshow. Slideshow, play from current slide. Here we go. So I'm going to be talking in fairly general terms about these artworks that we're going to look at. But the goal is to try to help you understand some of the major changes that happened to art from traditional China moving forward into the People's Republic. And really the central theme here is going to be realism. Realism, which as you will see is going to be interpreted in many different ways. Trying to somehow show truth in the painting that you create. How is that done? So here is a traditional painting. Look at it here. It's done with ink on silk, with a brush, and you can see, so what is this depicting? It's a natural scene. Here's water that's sort of hinted at. There's a sky, but you can't quite make out anything in the distance. Notice that most of this painting is empty. In this particular painting, the goal is not to depict everything that is visible to the viewer, but to try to hint at sort of the emotion of it or the feeling of it, and especially hinting at sort of the unknowability of nature. You have very finely detailed leaves here, and what do you have here? Here's something human created. There's a little boat, but it's off to the side, and sort of the mark of humanity is pushed off to the side in this. Whereas the unknowability of the larger part of the painting is the real subject. In a similar vein, here's some cherry blossoms. And again, there's sort of a roughness to nature, not trying to do sort of a scientific exact replication like in a photograph of some kind, but instead sort of hinting at it, and in doing so, in sort of the abstractness of these shapes and these sort of images of leaves in the back that are just sort of all in one color. Again, this elevates nature because it makes it sort of just out of the reach of knowability of the painter. And this painting would be the product of somebody spending an enormous amount of time looking at a cherry blossom and trying to understand its essence. Another traditional painting, this one, as you can see from his hair, this is from the Qing dynasty. He's wearing the queue. Whoops. So here is a picture of a person. He is a scholar. You can tell by his long robes. And you have this gnarled looking tree, which is a very Taoist image. The Taoists were really into trees that were gnarled and twisted. But look here at what's going on, how the shape of the man's body sort of follows the shape of the tree. This is an image of a scholar being sort of absorbed into nature, that nature is what sets the lines of this, and the human being just sort of accords to them. You see the wrinkles in his robes are similar to sort of the wrinkles on the tree. And what's he looking at? We don't know. The painting doesn't tell us. He's gazing off into the distance, again, trying to comprehend something beyond himself and beyond his own immediate experience. Similar image here. Here's a Taoist sitting on a rocky outcropping, gazing out at nature. Again, most of this is empty space. The sky is just sort of hinted at with the brush. And again, the shape of his robes sitting down is similar to the shape of the rock that he's sitting on. So he's sort of trying to become one with nature. And again, so nature is elevated and humanity can really just try to sort of comprehend it or understand it or be in accord with it. Now for something completely different. This painting brings us to the May 4th era. And so look at this incredible disjunction between these watercolor paintings full of emptiness, full of sort of abstraction, and this very literal painting from the May 4th era. This would be from a Chinese painter who had studied Western painting. And this is a Western style painting. You can see sort of in the shading of things, in the very careful delineation of the outlines, trying to represent things as they actually were. Yet, look at the fabric here. Here's a Chinese touch. That wrinkle in there is very similar to the wrinkles on his robe or the wrinkles on his robe. That makes its way in, and there are parts of the painting that are still left empty, but for the most part, this is a Western style painting. You have a martini glass. There is nothing less traditionally Chinese than a martini. I mean, actually it's kind of pink, so maybe it's a cosmopolitan. You have a coffee percolator. You have a Western book with an English title. So all of these are sort of Western artifacts being used by a Chinese artist who is influenced by the West. And if you want to think about the cultural movement of May 4th, that's part of what it was. It was all these returned intellectuals using Western styles of writing and Western styles of painting to try to reinvigorate Chinese culture. Another May 4th era painting. This one is a self-portrait of a painter. And you look at this and you can ask, what makes this a Chinese painting? Well, of course it's a Chinese painting. It was painted by a Chinese person. But somebody at the time looking at it, well, you can tell by his face that he's Chinese. But he's wearing a Western shirt, he's wearing a Western tie, he's wearing a Western suit, he has his hair cut in a Western style. The painting is done in a Western style. It's an oil painting. Every square inch of the painting has something on it. It's entirely filled in a Western style. The shading on his face is very much in a Western style. And so this, I mean, you can think of this as sort of an emblem of May 4th. Western style Chinese substance. And this is an example of the importing of foreign styles of artistic creation in order to try to bring something new into China. Here's another style of artwork that was popular in the May 4th era. This is a woodcut. So the artist would sort of draw a picture and then carve it into a wood block and then use that to stamp out copies of it. And one of the reasons for this was in the May 4th era, they thought that art needed to be shared widely, that it shouldn't just be the province of elite scholars. So a wood block could make mass production feasible. If you carved the wood block, you could make hundreds or even thousands of copies of a certain work of art just by printing it over and over and over. This would bring art out to the masses, to the general public, and in the sort of the sharp lines of this are again, because it's a woodcut, sort of black and white. But you can also see that the subject here is celebrating May 4th style intellectualism. This is a bookstore, and they have all kinds of newspapers hanging from the walls. They have books and pamphlets for people to look at, and it's celebrating a new culture of books that people are supposed to read widely, that are going to share new ideas. These aren't just tucked away in some scholar's library. These are available in large numbers to anyone who wants to wander into this store. Here's another wood block, and here we're getting into the question of realism. So if the traditional Chinese painters that we looked at were trying to get at the true essence of nature and realizing that they simply couldn't comprehend it fully, so therefore they could not paint it fully. Here in the May 4th era, the goal of realism was to show the reality of society, show what's really happening to people who live in China. Here we have an old woman with her head on her arm. You have a boy who's sort of dressed in clothes that don't fit him. He's barefoot. These are poor people. These are not the kind of people that would have been the subject of art in traditional China. There you would have scholars or officials or simply images of nature, animals, things like that. But poor people, like this old woman and this boy, these are something that the May 4th era intellectuals want to uncover and write about and paint about for the first time to show how traditional society has failed the Chinese people. In this particular woodblock, this is a critique. This is a picture of unhappy people. Similarly, here is an image of a beggar. This is also a woodblock print. Whoops. And you can see he's shivering, his clothes are rags, he's skin and bones, as this wealthier person with a long coat just goes walking on past him, ignoring him. So the realism that we have here is trying to show the darker realities of society, that society, as it has traditionally been represented in art, is sort of happy and fruitful. For these May 4th artists, society is actually cruel. It leaves people behind. It creates poverty and oppression. And by showing this in art and by printing it in thousands of copies and getting it out, we can awaken people to the fact that society needs help, that China needs to be reawakened and reinvigorated. So again, all of this is May 4th era intellectualism. Here's one of the most famous woodblock prints from May 4th. Look at it for a moment. What do you think is going on here? We have this sort of brutal image of a man tied up in rope. He's blindfolded, he can't see, he's screaming, he's yelling, his hands are clenched, desperately trying to find some means of escape. And you look, and here is a knife on the ground, just out of reach, where he cannot quite reach it, he can't quite find it. This particular image is meant to represent China. China being bound by its feudal, oppressive past, bound by the strictures of Confucianism, bound by the old society, cruelly tied up, blind to everything that's going on around it, trying to escape, and the means for its escape are just out of reach. And that knife in the May 4th era represents art, and it represents literature, and it's a way of liberating China, cutting those bonds, releasing it, making it free again, awakening it, all of this being the goal of saving China in the 1920s. Now we come into the People's Republic, and here we go into an image. I mean, the detail in here is just amazing. I wish I had a higher res version of it. It's like you practically expect to see Waldo in here somewhere. But you have, so here is the arrival of the People's Liberation Army in Beijing. There are elements of traditional Chinese painting. Here's traditional architecture. Here are these little clouds that fill up parts of it. These are traditional touches rolling in. But for the most part, it's this happy, colorful image of the masses. People marching in formation, carrying flags, riding on the backs of trucks, people climbing up on top of artillery pieces as they go through this parade. And it's an image of color and light and happiness and joy. And this is art serving the revolution. This is one way of art serving the revolution. Here's Mao over here. Here's Mao down here. The artist here is elevating the revolution, elevating the masses of people. Unlike the May 4th era, it's not trying to show that they are suffering at this point, because this is a rendition of capturing Beijing by the communist armies. So instead, it's showing how happy everyone is, that now they have been liberated, now there is joy, now there will be peace. It's an incredibly optimistic image. Here's some early PRC paintings. Compare this to the earlier images of the scholars sitting under the tree or the Taoists sitting on the rock. This is done in a traditionally Chinese style of watercolor, same kinds of lines. There's the empty background back here. But what is the subject? The subject is a peasant family. 4 generations. You have the little girl, her father, his father, and the old grandfather with his pipe. And look, that all of them, even though they're increasingly weathered, they all look very healthy for their age. This bright-eyed little girl and the young peasant with rosy cheeks. This is along the lines of Mao's talks on art and literature at Yan'an, that the role of art is to elevate the masses. It's to serve the masses, to serve the revolution. So the particular image of peasants that we have here is of healthy, strong peasants. They are not starving like the ones in the May 4th era, because the implication here is that now that we have the new state of the People's Republic of China, the peasants are healthy and happy once again. So instead of the realism of this painting trying to critique the health of the nation, it's trying to really represent just how good everything is for these peasants. They are not rich, they are not wealthy, but they have dishes to eat out of. Look how strong the guy over on this in the red shirt is. Look at those massive muscles. You see a lot of this in socialist art in China, which is representation of the strength of working people. And the kind of muscles you get for working people are working muscles. They're like massive forearms, thick chests. You have like really strong legs. These are the muscles of somebody doing manual labor. They're not like, Arnold Schwarzenegger, giant pecs, biceps, work out in the gym kind of a thing. This is a glorification of manual labor and the strength of a farmer. And so again, look at just how healthy they are, these bright white teeth, the happy expressions on their faces, rosy cheeks, all of this indicating that these people are strong peasants with a good life who can take the time to have their portrait painted. More watercolors. Here's a watercolor. This one is depicting a somewhat traditional scene. See, the leaves of this bamboo here are very similar to the bamboo in those earlier traditional paintings. You have the traditional academy architecture, trees that are very much in the style of the Taoist paintings that we saw earlier on. But there is only one person in this painting who is dressed like a scholar with the long robes. And who is that? It's Mao. Mao is the teacher of the People's Republic. And so in this particular painting, it is Mao who is teaching these people who are workers. These are peasants. Look at how they're dressed with their jackets. Look at these wraps on their legs. The winding wraps around their lower legs. This is what peasants wore for working in the fields, that it kept their pants from dragging in the mud. So these are working class or peasant class men listening excitedly as Mao, the traditional intellectual from this traditional academy, is teaching them about the new ways. So again, it's bringing together the traditional architecture, traditional painting style, and a traditional figure of a scholar, who is Mao, and putting it together with the subject of peasants being educated, and peasants being led by this one, the one foremost intellectual of China. Here's another Mao portrait. Here, this one's from the 1960s. And look at him. He's this jolly, ruddy old man depicted as a peasant. He's a little overweight, Mao was, but he's wearing humble clothing. He's got his pants are a little baggy, so he has the belt cinched up. He's got a peasant's hat to keep the sun off, but you can see by his skin tone, and this is important here, by his skin tone, you can see that he's been out in the sun for a long time. And this is a sign that he is one of the people, and he's one of the peasants, and he spends time. He's not just tucked away in an office up in the capital somewhere. No, he's dressed as if he's going to go on an inspection tour of a farm somewhere. But again, here, look at how much of this is left empty. So it's a traditional style painting with a modern style subject during the People's Republic. This is a famous painting. It was made in 1959, I believe, and the artist was named Shi Lu. This painting, it was a huge painting that the artist made to be hung in the Great Hall of the People up in Beijing, or the massive center of government there. This painting is meant to represent, it was meant to represent 1947 during the Civil War. It's titled Fighting in North Shanxi, and this is Mao leading his people and leading his army ultimately to victory. And these craggy mountains evoke the traditional paintings of those rock formations, the sort of the unknowability of nature, except here, as nature fades off into the distance, we have this impossible landscape of just harsh cliffs and ravines and dangers. This becomes metaphorical in this painting. That these are the dangers that lie ahead. Nationalist armies, feudal oppression, imperialism, all of these things that lie in China's path. And here is Mao calmly looking out. his hands between his hands behind his back. You can tell it's Mao from his hair and from his portliness. But he's looking out and planning how he is going to lead the people of China across this wilderness. Pretty powerful stuff. Now, here's an important thing about art in the People's Republic, that interpretation was extremely important, and it's going to be very important going forward. That a writer could write something that they thought meant one thing, but if somebody else comes along and says, no, actually, if you read it this way, it means something completely different, that could be what it became. So here, the intention in this painting of the artist was to show Mao's great leadership and to show the artist's faith in him to lead China through these incredible wildernesses that lie ahead. Others saw it differently. In particular, they said, well, why is Mao so small? Why is he so tiny there? Why isn't he big like in one of these paintings? Are you implying that Mao is unimportant and that nature is more important? Other people said, well, where are all the other people? It doesn't look like anyone's following him. There's sort of this pile of stuff. There's like a person carrying things, but where are all of the people following him? If he's supposed to be followed, this makes it look like he's all alone and nobody cares about him. Other people came along and said, well, you look at this painting, it looks like Mao is about to fall off a cliff. And basically, people who took that line argued that what the painter is secretly saying is that Mao is leading China off a cliff and that he's going to destroy us all. So thanks to all of these criticisms, ultimately the artist wound up being imprisoned. He was locked up for several years, forbidden to create any art, and he went insane in the course of that. So there are real dangers to our artistic creation in the People's Republic, that you want to have a form of realism that celebrates the revolution and elevates Mao, but these are artists, and they also want to bring in traditional Chinese art and use it in these new ways, even though the more abstract the images become, the more liable they are to reinterpretation. More scenes of victory. Here is Mao with PLA soldiers and peasants all working together. You can see the soldier is carrying a farm implement. Their guns are stacked up over here because this shows that the soldiers help the people. Here are soldiers back in the background here helping to pull a plow through the fields. And it signifies everything that the party wanted you to know and believe. Mao, the smiling leader, everyone looking, the guy looking up to him, that the soldiers and the peasants are one, the people in the army are one, the soldiers help in the fields, the peasants help with the fighting. All of this represents ideals. This painting, an oil painting, this is a model of Soviet-style socialist realism. So this is a Soviet style of painting. Here we have Marx and Lenin and Mao all in a line. In the actual setting here, of course, Marx and Lenin are on the wall. But in the painting that you are looking at, they're all in a line. And so the implication of that, of course, is that Mao is the Chinese inheritor of the legacy of Marx and Lenin, and then you move on to China. And here you have an audience full of peasants in heavy coats up in the north, peasants and workers looking up, hanging on his every word as he's there. And this jacket ultimately becomes called a Mao jacket, and eventually everybody in China will be wearing one. A couple more for today. Here is a realism. Here is a realist painting, in the sense of the May 4th era, trying to show the degradation of society and the suffering of the people. Look at the men in this painting. They look almost like animals. Their ribs are showing through. This one is walking with his arms practically touching the ground like a Neanderthal. All of them look, their skins are black. Their skin is blackened. They're reaching forward. So they're practically like zombies coming out of a hole here. These are miners being led by a Communist Party activist. This is Liu Shaoqi. He's going to be president later on. He's the only one who doesn't look degraded because he's the representative of the party. And this is realistic in depicting human suffering because it is pointing to a time before the revolution. So this is a famous miners' uprising led by the communists. And here he is leading the miners out of their hole in the ground, and their vengeance, this anger you can see in their eyes, this grim set purpose is going to be to destroy those who have oppressed them, and ultimately to help to lead this revolution that will build a new state. The last painting I'll leave you with is an ironic one. This is in the style of socialist realism. Again, a painting, it's an oil painting in sort of the Soviet socialist realist style. It's a Western style painting with a Chinese subject, and these are peasant girls. This is in the time of the Great Leap Forward, and here is a picture of happy, healthy, radiant girls with rosy cheeks, rosy plump cheeks, sitting on a pile of corn, this massive surplus of food, looking happily, captured at a moment of, they've been playing around. These are not images of suffering. This is an attempt to show a reality that in this case happens to be purely imaginary. The goal of the painting is to show the success of the Great Leap Forward, that Mao's economic plans have led to an incredible surplus of grain. The peasants are well fed and they're happy and they have leisure time. There is no suffering at all in this painting. It is realist in that it depicts everything very carefully in the image. The actual realism of this, however, does not exist. It was painted at a time when peasants were starving by the millions, that there were not images like this to be found. So this is where I'm going to leave you with the artworks for today. This is an example of how so-called realist art can be depicting an imaginary realism in contrast to the actual reality of society. So you have realism like the May 4th era, which is trying to represent genuine suffering in society. And by the time you get to the socialist realism of the 1950s and 60s, it's instead trying to show the ideal of society, even if the reality does not match that. Okay, so we'll stop with that for now. Why don't we throw up a map for something, just so you don't have to look at me on your screen all the time. Here comes the map. All right, so when we left off last time, we had the 100 Flowers movement as a way of bringing intellectuals back into the fold in China. Here, I'll make this a little bit bigger. Make me a little bit bigger there. See if that worked. We had the 100 Flowers movement, followed almost immediately by a crackdown, the anti-rightist campaign starting in 1957, a crackdown on those who had criticized the party during the 100 Flowers when they were supposed to be criticizing the party at the party's orders. So the inescapability of some of these campaigns, that no matter how carefully somebody tried to thread their way through the various campaigns that are going to come, it's always possible to be caught on the wrong side. And the rapid shift from the 100 Flowers movement into the anti-rightist campaign, which punished many of the people who had taken part in the 100 Flowers, this is a sign of many things to come. As I said at the end of the last lecture, 1957 is the first of what are known as China's 20 lost years, a period of the People's Republic with incredible loss of life, and in a time of changes, some of which were beneficial and many of which were not. So the anti-rightist campaign is going to lead us forward towards the Great Leap Forward, which is our subject today. So let's turn and talk about agriculture, because that's what's going to matter the most in the in the Great Leap Forward. As I said at the end of the last lecture, and sort of looking forward to today, the Great Leap Forward is going to involve the starvation of 20 to 30 million Chinese people between 1958 and the early 1960s. This was arguably the most cataclysmically ineffective economic plan ever devised. And really one of the worst human disasters, one of the worst human-made disasters in history. So how did it come about? It came about through collectivization. Here, I'll put the terms up on the board here so you can see the various collectivization terms that we have. So collectivization means bringing people together to work collectively. And there are different gradations of this and different steps along the road to collectivization. So Going back to the early 1950s, with the Korean War, which we talked about last week, by the end of that, you have a fanatically united China, united behind Mao, united against the United States, looking to the Communist Party for guidance. And it was after the Korean War was over that Mao really could begin this process of moving the mountains. Remember this term voluntarism. Mao's belief that the human will is the most powerful force in the universe. And that if the people are united in their minds and in their wills, there is no natural obstacle that they cannot overcome. Again, this was the one that he explained with the old story of the old man moving the mountain, but arguing that the Chinese people, if they work together, they can get rid of feudalism, they can get rid of imperialism, there is nothing they cannot do. Mass campaigns were a way of channeling this mass will, or of creating a mass will. By instructing people to act in certain ways together, you could teach them a mindset where they had a shared will that could, again, begin moving the mountains. So the stalemate in the Korean War wasn't reached until 1953, at which point about 1 million Chinese soldiers had been killed. There is one theory from a Chinese scholar at Cornell that this was deliberate on Mao's part, going into this war, even with all of the bloodshed that it brought about, was that this was Mao's way of bringing the people together firmly and shutting out any kind of dissent, because there is nothing that will more readily unify a nation than to have an outside enemy that they feel threatened by. In any case, in 1953, we have the first 5-year economic plan following a Soviet model of state-controlled development. And this was a Stalinist model of economic development. The goal was to build up heavy industry, especially in North China, and also increase dramatically China's output of coal, steel, and machinery. And by the mid-1950s, you have the first steps towards collectivized agriculture, under a belief and a hope that land reform and collectivizing life on the farms would lead to greater production. So here are the steps. The first step are mutual aid teams, or MATs. A mutual aid team involves low-level cooperation between households in rural areas. So farming families were put together in mutual aid teams, about 10 families each. Within these mutual aid teams, you would still own your own stuff. If you had draft animals, if you had tools, you would own your own property, but you would cooperate together in the fields with these other 9 families. And this was implemented by 1956. In 1956, 92% of rural households were part of a mutual aid team. And this worked well. So they moved on to bigger things. The next step was a low-level agricultural producers cooperative, or an APC. A low-level APC involved combining 3 to 5 mutual aid teams. So each of these mutual aid teams has about 10 families. A low-level agricultural producers cooperative, it's a hard word, it's a hard phrase to say, would have about 30 to 50 households. The members of a low-level APC would contribute their land, they would contribute their animals, and they would contribute their tools to the cooperative. But as they contributed their property, they would get shares in return. So those who contributed more of their property would get more of a share of the output of the cooperative. So if you had more land, or if you had better animals, or if you had more tools, you would get a larger share of what this produced. These were less successful. There were many peasants who did not want to hand over their fields to a group of 30 or 50 other families. And when peasants resisted, they sometimes had to be forced to take part in this. But to go against this policy was to go against the mass line, because as the party was understood to speak on behalf of the masses and what they wanted, to go against the party was to go against the will of the people. The enthusiasm of government cadres, of government officials at the local level in rural areas, these were ideological zealots. These were people who loved Mao, who loved the revolution. The ones who had been critical had been generally purged along the way. They had very little patience for gradual change. They had great hope in Mao's vision of voluntarism, that if they could just get all of the people to work together, there was nothing they could not accomplish. So the Communist Party had come to power through very careful planning and very gradual land reform, very flexible practices during the Sino-Japanese War. But now when they had total control over the country, now after the Korean War, when they had enormous political capital, exuberance really took over and started pushing farmers ever more quickly into larger and larger organizations. So from the low-level APCs, we then shift to higher-level APCs. These are, again, high-level agricultural producers cooperatives. These ones had 200 to 300 households. By the end of 1956, again, all in the space of a year from when people were put into mutual aid teams, by the end of 1956, 88% of peasants were in a higher-level APC. In a high-level APC, aside from having 200 to 300 families involved, these would all be people living right in the same area, all land was owned by the collective. There was no more private ownership of even garden plots or little bits of land. And there was no longer any investment part of this. Payment was purely on the basis of labor. So no matter how much of your land or how much of your property had been given over to the collective, to the cooperative, the payment that you got out of it, the money that you got out or the grain that you got out of it, was for how much labor you put in for this group. So again, by the end of 1956, 88% of the rural population of peasants was in one of these high-level APCs. From an organizational standpoint, it was an amazing achievement to reorganize the massive Chinese countryside in this way, but was it wise? Because they are departing rapidly from practices of farming that had been in place for millennia in the countryside, that have been handed down from generation to generation in the countryside. Now they're embarking on something entirely new. So, moving forward, with the collectivization of the mid-1950s, these agricultural producers cooperatives, the numbers of the data coming out of these that was being sent back to the capital in Beijing didn't really suit the reality of what was happening on the ground, we now know. The cooperatives didn't function very well. But the central planners, all they saw was the numbers coming out of them for grain production, for production of other things. And it seemed to those in the capital that things were working far better than in reality they actually were. And after the anti-rightist campaign, which attacked critics of the party, there was very little incentive to make criticisms. That last painting that I showed you, that painting of the ruddy-faced, happy peasant girls sitting on their mound of corn, paintings like that were acceptable at this point in time. Ones that showed things going wrong were not, and that anyone who painted something like that would be branded as a rightist and as a critic of the party, and they'd go into labor reform. The peasantry had great faith in Chairman Mao. There was genuine enthusiasm at this time for his leadership, along with an old, long-standing belief on the part of peasants that the state knows best. If you think back in imperial times when the emperor was the son of heaven and it was his calendar who told them when to farm, when to bring in the grain, and if things were going well, they believed that it was because the emperor was good and he had the mandate of heaven. Similarly, peasants still generally believed that the central state knew best and that it was best to follow their instructions. And there's also optimism, that they believe that a great future is coming in this new state. And so they're willing, some of them were resistant, many of them were perfectly willing to do as they were told. So the first 5-year plan, the one from 1953 to 1958, seemed to succeed. This was good, but it was not sustainable. But there were not economists who were weighing in on whether this was a sustainable level of change and of development. They probably should have shifted from heavy industry to light industry, produced more consumer goods. some kind of incentives for peasants to work hard, but Mao felt otherwise. And what Mao wanted to see was a reinvention of the entire countryside. I'm going to put the countryside up here. Here's our map again. The massive, gigantic countryside, the vast majority of China's population lived in rural areas, not in the cities. Mao had a vision of reinventing the countryside, of totally reorganizing rural labor, believing again that if he could harness the energy of the masses, that he could accomplish anything in China. So here was his plan, to mobilize mass labor in the countryside for public works, for irrigation projects, flood control, dams, land reclamation, mobilize huge amounts of labor for projects like that, while simultaneously increasing the productivity of existing land by having more people work on it. And at the same time, also a third goal of expanding local industry to produce local goods locally. Heavy industry, as he saw it, would just be for export to sell to other countries, whereas the industrial needs of the country could be produced at a local level all throughout the country. Since the anti-rightist campaign, nobody listens to economists anymore, or the economists that know better know to keep their mouths shut. Planning for all of this was in the hands of ideologues who believed in Mao and believed in voluntarism. Local officials, local cadres were responsible for local goals. And again, these people were ideologues. They were not experts. They were generally contemptuous of educated people or of book learning. They were driven by vision. They were driven by zeal. They were driven by deep loyalty to the party and to Chairman Mao. So here's one of the first major campaigns of this, one of the first major agricultural campaigns of this era, the Four Pests campaign, January of 1958. This was a campaign to get rid of sparrows, flies, mosquitoes, and rats. Again, the four pests were sparrows, flies, mosquitoes, and rats. These are pests that are harmful. In the case of mosquitoes, they spread disease, and in the case of things like sparrows and rats, they eat grain and they cut into agricultural production. The goal of the campaign was to eradicate these in China. And the way that it was implemented was that all across China, in rural areas, the peasants were mobilized for this Four Pests campaign in 1958 to kill all the sparrows and the flies and mosquitoes and rats, swat them, hit them, whatnot. As far as the sparrows, people went outside with pots and pans banging on them, and every time a bird landed on a tree nearby, they would start banging a pot or a pan under it, and the bird would be terrified and would fly away, and the little bird would land in another tree where there was another peasant banging on a pot, and so it would fly over to the eave of a house somewhere, and there would be a child there banging on a pot and a pan, and this total mobilization, this mass level orchestration of people out with their pots and pans, these poor little sparrows would bounce from place to place with nowhere to land, terrified out of their minds, and ultimately they would drop dead. This succeeded in its goal of absolutely decimating the sparrow population in large parts of rural China. And think of how many people had to be working together to make this possible. So from a collectivist standpoint, this is an amazing accomplishment. All of these people working together at a single-minded project of eradicating the sparrows. However, they had not talked to any ecologists in coming up with this plan. And as many of you, I am sure, know, sparrows eat insects. And without the sparrows to eat them, those insects multiply. So the aftermath of this Four Pests campaign was a dramatic increase in insects that were eating grains. It was entirely counterproductive, and it turned out to be extremely harmful to agriculture rather than beneficial. In February of 1958, so just after the Four Pests campaign, February of 1958, the National People's Congress announced the Great Leap Forward for the next 3 years. This was a new economic plan for the 3 years starting in 1958, and it had incredibly high goals. The 1958 goal was a 19% increase in steel production, an 18% increase in electricity, and a 17% increase in coal production. So nearly 20% increases. This is an undeveloped agrarian nation without an industrial base, except what was left by the Japanese, aiming for a nearly 20% increase in steel, electricity, and coal production. The slogan of the Great Leap Forward was to surpass Britain and catch up to America in 15 years. Again, a poor agricultural nation, not modernized in any industrial way, aiming in 15 years to catch up to Britain in America, and then to surpass Britain, to make more coal and steel than Britain, and catch up to America. So in 1958, the Great Leap Forward takes off. It's an incredible unleashing of enthusiasm, of labor, of collective action. 650 million Chinese were mobilized for the Great Leap Forward. Building new roads, building factories, building dams, entirely new cities were built, cultivation of the land, rebuilding farms. And as a part of this, they left behind even the agricultural producers' cooperatives. And peasants were now organized into even larger people's communes. These are people's communes, which incorporated about 30 of the high-level agricultural producers' cooperatives. So about 30 high-level APCs, meaning about 5,500 households in a typical commune, or about 25,000 people. These were huge. These were the size of small cities, all being brought together as a commune. Nothing like this had ever been attempted in history, and nothing like this had ever worked. By November of 1958, there were 26,000 people's communes, accounting for 98% of the farm population of China. Again, 98 out of 100 farmers by November of 1958 were part of one of these massive communes of about 25,000 people living collectively, working the land collectively. With the communes, things were somewhat different. Here there was communal ownership of all property. No private plots were allowed, no private ownership of any kind of property was allowed, no private livestock were allowed, and earnings from the commune were entirely per capita. Every single person in the commune was given an equal share in the commune's production. Whereas in the APCs, I mean, earlier on with collectivization, if you put in more property, you got more of what the group created. Later on, it was you didn't get anything based on your property, but the more labor you did, the more you got out. With the communes, it was entirely just by existence. You got a particular share. So there was no more increase in your share due to how much work you did. So there was essentially no more incentive to work. At least there was no incentive to work for the sake of getting anything concrete. You worked for the sake of the commune and for the sake of the revolution. And as it would turn out, that kind of an incentive was not nearly as powerful for individual farmers as getting something for themselves or for their family. In July of 1958, as part of the industrial goals of the Great Leap Forward, there was a campaign to produce steel locally. And let me put this image up here. This is an image of the backyard furnaces, as they were called. All these little clay furnaces were for smelting steel. So the backyard furnaces campaign, it was a campaign in July of 1958 to produce steel locally, to produce steel goods that could be used locally or could go towards export. And the goal of this, and this was a major part of the Great Leap Forward, was to decentralize industry. The Soviet model was having centers of heavy industry that would produce all of the country's steel and coal and things like that. The goal of this backyard furnaces campaign was, it was a vision that steel could be produced almost everywhere. And that if the peasants on their communes built their own steel smelting furnaces, they could be creating steel. And if they were creating steel and all of the other communes were, then China's steel production would go up in incredibly dramatic ways. So this begins in July of 1958. In July alone, tens of thousands of these clay furnaces were set up in communes around China. By August, there were 190,000 of them reportedly. By September, 700,000 of them. And by November, there were 1 million of them. Now let's think about this for a moment. 1 million furnaces set up across rural China in the countryside by peasants taking part in this campaign, peasants living on their communes. The goal was to produce steel. How are you going to produce steel on a farm? We'll come back to that. There was a competition between the communes to see who could produce the most steel, and therefore who could show the most zeal for the revolution and for the Great Leap Forward. The way that they found the raw materials for their steel was essentially by melting down all of the metal they could get their hands on. So since the communes had communal kitchens, people didn't need the kitchens in their houses anymore. So they melted down their cooking implements, they melted down their personal tools, they tore out window frames from houses and melted those down. So every kind of metal they could get their hands on, they would pull it all together and then melt it down in one of these million furnaces designed for smelting steel. I'm going to read you just a little propaganda piece from this period. So this is a view of steel making in Hunan province during this campaign. And it goes, so this is an image, this is realist in the sense of promoting the revolution and what they want this to be. Iron and steel production is not simply a technical job. This piece, incidentally, is also going to help illustrate the connection between working on a farm or melting down steel and the revolution with a capital R. Iron and steel production is not simply a technical job, it is also a political task that has an important bearing on all other activities. So this is a political act to smelt steel, that you are helping to strengthen China, and you are therefore helping the revolution and helping to destroy imperialism and feudalism. After the introduction of the idea of steel making, I'm still reading from this source, more than 500,000 pledges were sent to the party in the Shaoyang region in support of the campaign. The people felt elated and stimulated. Millions of hearts had only one wish. Here is voluntarism in action. Millions of hearts with one wish. Millions of hearts had only one wish: to fight hard to achieve and surpass the goal of producing 300,000 tons of steel in 1958. The people composed a song describing it. So this is a song about those furnaces over here. The song goes, the song doesn't translate well into English, but anyhow, the Communist Party is really wonderful. In 3 days, more than 1,000 furnaces were built. The masses' strength is really tremendous. The American imperialists will run off with their tails between their legs. The Chinese people will now surpass Britain. The east wind will always prevail over the west wind. Let's unpack this. The Communist Party is wonderful. In 3 days, more than 1,000 furnaces were built. Look what we can accomplish when we work together. The masses' strength is really tremendous. This is a demonstration of the strength of the masses, the building of these furnaces. The American imperialists will run off with their tail between their legs. They will be terrified by China's industrial production. The Chinese people will now surpass Britain. Britain, who fought the Opium Wars against China. Britain, who is traditionally the greatest Western oppressor of China. China will now surpass Britain in its steel output. And then finally, this line, the east wind will always prevail over the west wind. This means Asia. This means China over the West. This means communism over Western-style democracy, or Western-style imperialism, as it would be talked about in China. However, so the mustering all of this genuine zeal, people were genuinely thrilled to be taking part in these campaigns, genuinely hopeful for what it would produce. There were no effective scientists on board guiding the creation of these furnaces, or metallurgists who could talk about how to properly smelt steel. In any case, all of these million furnaces that were set up did not burn hot enough. They were, you know, fueled by straw and wood and things like that. They didn't burn hot enough to make proper steel. Instead, everything was melted down into what was known as pig iron, which is a kind of iron that cracks quite easily, and it's essentially useless for industrial purposes. In the process of creating millions of tons, at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tons of pig iron, most of the tools and metal implements in the countryside were just on these communes were destroyed in order to try to make steel that turned out just to be pig iron. Furthermore, to fuel those million furnaces and keep them going night and day for smelting steel, that in itself led to wide-scale deforestation, as communes cut down the trees on hillsides nearby in order to get more fuel to fire the furnaces. In places where they ran out of wood, there were stories of them digging up coffins and using the wood from the coffins to fuel these furnaces. All of it, in the end, resulting in simply the destruction of useful metal and deforestation that would lead to flooding. But unbelievable statistics were coming out of the State Statistical Bureau. In 1958, food production on the communes doubled, or at least so claimed the communes themselves. And the Communist Party officials on these communes, their career was at stake in reporting what was being produced, and they naturally inflated their figures in order to impress their higher-ups. So according to the numbers coming to the central government, food production had doubled in 1958. Crucially, the goals that the central government set for the next year, for 1959, were based on those inflated claims of high production in 1958. Even if those numbers in 1958 were accurate, 1958 had had very good weather. 1959 would not be nearly as good. And the statistics would continue to claim rising production in the countryside, when in reality, and here's the true reality of the Great Leap Forward, in fact, agricultural production was probably declining fairly quickly. Huge amounts of labor was mobilized to dig ditches and build dams. There was reports of 1 million people being involved in single land reclamation projects along the coast. Many of these projects were pointless. They were digging lakes in order to build a mountain as an honor to the old man moving the mountain. But all of those people taking part in the organized labor or running the furnaces, all of those people running the furnaces were not working in the fields. So there were not enough hands on the communes to harvest the grain that did come up in what was already a bad year. And yet the government kept demanding more grain from the communes, even as crops were beginning to fail, and even as there were not enough strong people out in the fields to harvest whatever grain was coming up. Looking forward, this is going to lead to mass starvation in the countryside, which we'll talk about next time. This is the darkest period of the People's Republic in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And we'll come back to that next time of how it happened, how it continued, how it ended, and what came afterwards. All right, thanks for being with me, and I will see you all on Wednesday.